So much fun record this. Oh my God, tech is not my forte. I'm so glad that there are people who does this sort of thing. Thank you so much for being here, Alex. It's so nice to have you. And it's been a really much anticipated conversation. I have been interviewed by you a few times, but it's nice to like have the table turn around this time because I'm so curious. Because every time I speak to you, I want to find out what have you learned from everyone that you've spoken to, because it's nice to have a snapshot of what is really going on in the industry. Um, Alex, would you mind if I start with some breath work just to kind of help us all regulate and come into the space and be present? And I hope it's okay with you all if I put a kind of tune on music. I'm just gonna check. Is everyone still there? Um, okay, right. So I'm gonna play this tune, and this is from Breathpod that I've recently come across when I went to a festival, and it was amazing. The guy who runs it's called Stuart, and he led us through a box breathing exercise that really helped to, brought us back to life after a long day at the festival. So I just want to start by saying, let's take a moment to ground together and sit comfortably. Gently close your eyes if that feels safe for you. And if you can just inhale through your nose for a slow count of 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold your breath softly at the top of 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. And exhale gently through your mouth for 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. And then pause at the bottom for 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Let's continue it for another round and letting your breath draw the shape of a square. Steady, balance, and calm. And let's start. Let's inhale through your nose for a slow count of 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold your breath softly at the top of 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. And exhale gently through your mouth for 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. And pause at the bottom for 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Notice how your body feels right now, how your mind settles, and bring your awareness fully back into this moment. So thank you for joining me, everyone. So I'm going to turn the music off for just a little bit of mindfulness to help us get into this conversation and have a fruitful conversation. I also try to keep track with the comments. I don't know how I'm going to do that because I've turned off the LinkedIn now. But thanks for joining me. I know this conversation has brought up some strong responses in the community. So I just wanted to begin by setting the stage for allyship. So we each bring curiosity and compassion to this conversation so we can learn and understand and also enable each of us to express ourselves and doing this respectfully also. So this remains a safe space for us all. And as for me, I'm Dr. Samantha Hiew, the founder of ADHD Girls, and I worked to a dual mission to empower neurodivergent women to thrive in the employment, workplace, education settings, as well as to elevate neurodiversity understanding through an intersectional lens. So as part of my work, I train organizations on neurodiversity and I empower neurodivergent women and mental health professionals to adequately diagnose and support neurodivergent women through my ADHD intersectional scientific practitioner program and community events such as the Neurodivergent Phoenix Convention that's coming up. And over to you, Alex. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Sam. And yeah, I really enjoyed the breath work. Um, my name's Alex Partridge. I'm the host of the ADHD Chatter podcast, which I launched about 2.5 years ago from my bedroom next door. That was about 120 episodes ago. And now, as you know, you've been there a few times yourself, Sam. Yeah, it's really kind of quite overwhelmingly grown extremely fast. Uh, and now it's in a studio in Battersea where I bring in amazing guests like yourself every week. And yeah, just trying to keep on top of everything really. Sort of not yeah, it's tricky when you're in the studio in Battersea and you're having a very private chat with the guest. It's a very quiet room. You've been there, just my producer and camera team, and to try and forget about the number of people that are listening. Um, and I think it's testament really to the demand for raw and honest conversations around ADHD, neurodiversity in general. It's a community that we know has been let down um, and underserved and felt misunderstood for a long time. So I think when the episodes go out and and you see the feedback, it's overwhelming. So yeah, I mean, essentially ADHD Chatter podcast host. Um, and yeah, no, pleased to be here.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. I do really think that, you have such strength and skill in growing social media, in such a short time. I remember first seeing you bursting into the scene. I was like, whoa, you're like the meteorite like, kind of rising. And I have, been really happy to, like I tune into your podcast and listen to specialists and live experience advocates and talk about their experience. And I've always been so curious about like any kind of common themes and patterns that you can spot from seeing where we are in the state of diagnostics and care with ADHD. And it's mainly around, do you think that people actually know what to do? Because from what I heard from you last time, that there is, so everyone's got different opinions and different ways of seeing things. So I want to understand, are people, you know, collectively getting their knowledge somewhere, or are they just picking and mixing, and what do you think?
Yeah, it's a great question, Sam. The truth is, we spoke about this earlier, is I've chatted to 120 guests now on the podcast. Obviously, there's some crossovers in the information, lots of crossovers, but a lot of the time, the opinions and viewpoints of the experts are completely contradicting one another. It seems to me that so many people are sort of grappling to understand ADHD independently, and they're also sort of grappling to understand autism independently, and all of the other conditions that strongly overlap with both of those two. And then when you throw the dual diagnosis or ADHD into the mix, there seems to be a small amount of understanding. And these are the people that people are going to in real crisis points when they're not understanding this internal tussle, this internal tug of war that they're experiencing. I'm reaching out to the people at the top of the field in this area, and there's so many like glaring contradictions to like how can you possibly expect GPs around the country or general doctors around the world to really understand the complexities of an ADHD person. It's incredibly difficult. I think we really have to lean on as many stories from people that either have the diagnosis or suspect that they have the dual diagnosis and join the dots. But we see it. You just feel massively misunderstood, and that's a word that comes up time and time again on the podcast. Misunderstood, um, almost panicked in trying to understand the contradictions that your brain has, like craving stimulation, but
Mhm.
being overly easily overstimulated, and so people go for stuff quite impulsively. They reach out for opportunities. They can get quite excited about things, social events, whatever it is. But then they kind of crash on the other side and experience this cycle of burnout. And all of these things really create this pattern of going for things and then experiencing burnout, and the sort of psychological knock-on effects of that can be really devastating. We see people truly having no self-esteem, um, no self-esteem, but also like a complete lack of understanding about who they really are as a person. From my experience from speaking to people on the podcast and meeting people and thousands of people now at events and just generally out and about. It's like they don't know who they are. The sort of self-awareness is incredibly low. Um, they mask more, I believe, than somebody who is perhaps just ADHD. Um, this desire to fit in sort of clashes with their innate ability to connect with who they really are. So they end up not knowing what opportunities are really a good fit for them. And that looks like what jobs people are going for, what relationships people are getting into, what domains people are buying for that new hobby. Um, and if you're not saying yes to the right opportunities, then when that honeymoon period passes and the dopamine runs out, essentially, that's when you're going to quit. That's when you're going to leave that relationship. That's when you're going to walk out the door of that job because you're too anxious to sit there at the computer for another day. That's when that graveyard is going to have another domain added to it. And we see if there's a pattern of this, it compounds negatively to truly believing that you can't do stuff. Like your self-esteem gets hit again. Like, why can't I just function like lots of other people seem to be able to do? Um, with ADHD specifically, I truly don't believe it's a deficit of attention. I think that when someone with ADHD and AuDHD finds something that connects with who they really are and their true passions, we don't have a deficit of attention. We have an abundance of attention. Like, that's when that person will be best in the world, world beating at that thing. They'll go on and achieve incredible things. I think
Yeah.
ADHD is more a deficit of self-awareness because of all of this masking that we do,
Yeah.
this shape-shifting, this pretending to be someone that we're not in order to not have someone's approval taken away from us and feel that horrible pain of criticism and rejection. Um, we're amazing shapeshifters and chameleons, and a consequence of that is we go through life not understanding what opportunities and things are a good fit for us. Working on our self-awareness is key, um, and asking ourselves some really simple questions as often as we can, like what happened today that made me happy? Um, what happened today that made me sad? What did I do today that I enjoyed? What did I do today that I struggled with? Really basic questions that, if we ask them as often as we can, we'll build up this like arsenal of self-awareness that I think will give us an edge, and it will enable us to almost have a much clearer understanding of who we are underneath. So when things do come into our now, new relationship, new job, new hobby, we can almost, we've got more information to see if it's in alignment. And I say that to people, and one of the things, well, I don't know who, like, how do I know if the answers to those questions is a mask? Sometimes the mask is so thick and so ingrained, and it's almost like we instinctively just say answers to those questions as part of the mask. And I think in those situations, it's so important to listen to those knee-jerk reactions. It's like those signals that your body gives off before your masked version has a chance to catch up. And for example, if you're um, reading a newspaper and you see a job for a musical theatre role, and you like instantly fill up with excitement towards auditioning for that musical theatre role.
Yeah.
Like, and like Raoul of Christine from Phantom of the Opera, my favorite show,
Oh, I love
and you
that.
fill up instantly, and it's like, but then you remember that your parents wanted you to be a doctor, or someone said something on the playground years ago, and you suppress that excitement towards that musical theatre role. Like that's that excitement towards those things. That's your knee-jerk reactions. That's your inner child like screaming out, trying to remind you after years of masking and pretending um, who you really are. I think it's so important to like intentionally listen to that that those knee-jerk reactions when you hear them.
Yeah. Thank you, Alex. I'm just also like listening to the comments on the show, and people have yeah, feel fully validated by your experience and seeing that, yeah, that's why so many of us are freelancers. We like to be in charge of our own schedule, but also like the strengths that we have, the work that we like to do may not necessarily be traditional or conventional, and it's down to us to create that in the first place. So what I have gleaned from speaking to you so many times is that you are somebody who are looking for answers. And actually, interestingly, I also had that process when I first started. I started with a podcast and a YouTube interviews with women with ADHD. And I think when I first came on the show with you, I had only an ADHD diagnosis, but then self-identified as autism. And then over time, I think you were also told that you could be ADHD, right? Because you were presenting with also autistic traits. And then over time, it took some time, like I think 7 months for me to finally get an autism diagnosis. And I really struggled to get it because the clinicians that I saw, like two of them actually put my symptoms down to trauma. And also because I was going through a life transition of a divorce. So it was conveniently, kind of put into the trauma camp. And also no one knew what autism looked like in women. I knew that what I was going through was more than ADHD because I know you're not medicated at the moment, and I think you did say you were looking into it. But I got medicated 8 months after I got diagnosed, and it took a few years for me to start feeling this life-altering medication side effects. And I'm not in any way saying medication isn't great because I still use it. I just use it at a dose that works really well for me. And for me, the dosage that was causing me some health issues, I mean, it was only around 40 milligrams because I've realized that with ADHD, the advice is really to start low and go slow. And I had 30 milligrams and 40 milligrams of lisdexamfetamine. And within 2 years, it started a lot earlier with the sleep issues and then overworking, like late at night. And then over time, I was turning up at almost every talk, having brain fog. And I thought, oh, put it down to perimenopause, which is, obviously a contributing factor with hormones and everything. But it was definitely how the medication interacted with the hormones and the neurobiology that was specific to me and so many ADHDers, and why I think this life is really important. Um, and it's a way for me to give back also is that the ADHD and the AuDHD neurotype is different. I've spoken to you about it quite a few times, and most people do find that, a lower dose works better for them. But the reality is that because of medication short supply, people do tend to start on perhaps a low enough dose, but then very quickly get put up to like a startlingly higher, much higher dose. Like sometimes it goes like 100% more than what they are used to. And people can start to feel, very drastically different. And for me, that was a gradual, kind of definitely, kind of downhill pattern of my health, where it started with sleep being affected, and then my breathing issues, kind of started where I was giving a talk for International Women's Day, and then I realized I couldn't breathe, and I could still talk even though I couldn't breathe. That was really scary. And I couldn't walk like 3 or 4 steps without really struggling to breathe and like clutching at my heart. And I wondered why for a really long time. And I did a deep dive into what it means to be ADHD in our neurotype and also our body, our co-occurring conditions. And just learning over the years, things like, yes, the ADHD neurotype may metabolize neurotransmitters at a slower rate than the ADHD neurotype, and also the co-occurring conditions, that often co-occur in autism, ADHD, like POTS, posterior orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, it affects like blood circulation and, the impact of all this, the medication, the hormones, and the co-occurring conditions did kind of went to my heart. And I was just wondering, how am I ever going to go back to what I was before, which was semi-healthy. So, yeah, that's when actually I was left to my own device to completely figure out what to do, because I approached a psychiatrist and they said, what do you want? I just told them what I wanted, thinking that they would advise. But then what they did was they just gave me what I asked for, was like I asked to lower my dose. And I went from 40 milligrams to 20 milligrams overnight. And it was an absolute devastation. And I remember then what it was like to have ADHD, because that incessant self-doubt, but it was even more compounded. It was like, oh, it all came crashing back. It was like that rumination, that like no focus, no like energy for, just being motivated. The procrastination is wow, just incessant. And because of the withdrawal effect, I couldn't even get motivated when I was interested in something. And then I remember what it was like, to live like that for so many years. Because I think what it is like when we get medicated, after our diagnosis with ADHD, we can sometimes forget. But, that also comes with so many issues. Like say if you're ADHD, it may help you in your focus, but then being capable, in your focus and productivity doesn't equally mean that you are well. I see so many neurodivergents, they may be productive, but then they go through a cycle of actually being on this hamster wheel where even if they are gradually like low level burnout, they don't actually come out of the burnout to recover because the medication keeps you going. And without that mindfulness of what it's doing to your body, like people are going in this perpetual hamster wheel forever. And I see, people around me, they they're really productive in their work, but then at the same time, you can see like they also need to look after their health, because there is a lot of stress that's going on in their body. And that's why, I'm doing this work. Yeah, so I'm actually really interested, like, to ask, like, have you heard anything around that, with the people you interview who maybe diagnose and treat people with ADHD versus ADHD, if they talk about medications at all?
Yeah, it's a thanks, Sam. I mean, it's such a, hearing you talk about the struggles that you've had, it's an echo of so many of the stories that I've heard. I think the ADHD experience is one of an exterior, sometimes look of being able to operate, but it's the internal, um, this more silent, invisible, extra work that you're having to put in order to achieve the same as other people sometimes. And that can, we see a lot of addiction with that makeup, which is really sad.
Mm.
Um, and it often comes as a shock to those around the person, um, because exteriorly they seem to almost be a high achiever. Um, but it's the extra workload that's going on psychologically for them to get there. I have shared my story on the podcast. I'm an alcoholic. If I can't drink. I describe ADHD and I suspect ADHD myself heavily, um, as having like these highly caffeinated squirrels barreling around in my head, and in some environments that can create, that's a positive. It can lead me to be creative and spot patterns and see details, and I think it's helped me in my social media career. But in other areas, in classrooms and lots of offices, and a lot of the time in my personal life, that when it gets too much and those squirrels have nowhere to go and it turns into anxiety, and in the past I've medicated that with alcohol. But at 36 now, I know that I can't drink. Um, if I have one drink, then I can't stop drinking, and that's led me to be in hospital many times in the past. And I'm so acutely aware now that my sobriety is the foundation of my life, really. Everything that I'm doing, my relationship, looking after my dog, doing the podcast, if I have a drink, everything falls down. And I think speaking to lots of people with on the podcast with ADHD, it's an echo of that. It's we can look at the actual pharmaceutical medication, but I think a lot of people are self-medicating with not necessarily alcohol, but with food or with shopping or spending money or isolating themselves, which is really sad as well. But I think ADHD is a very lonely experience for many people. Um, and you want to be social. You can see a picture on Instagram of a group of people on a social trip, and you can get FOMO and miss out and feel, why am I not there? But then you're not there because you're so scared of putting yourself out there. Um, because again, it's like the RSD. It's you don't want to put yourself in the firing line, the potential to be criticized. So you say no to that thing. Um, it's really heartbreaking. But yeah, we see, I think the propensity to self-medicate is high, and that can be really subtle. I think social withdrawal is a big one. And it's a high risk area because, we see heightened anxiety, depression, really poor comorbidities with ADHD, and then you've got someone who's perhaps withdrawing socially because they're scared of socializing, or they're scared of someone rejecting them, so they don't put themselves out there, and so they don't have anyone to talk to, and they need to sort of release some of that pressure and talk about their mental health. I think so many people with ADHD, they're carrying like burdens inside their head that so many people just don't understand, and they feel like if they try to explain it to someone, they're just going to be a nuisance to someone. So they further isolate themselves, they further withdraw, um, and it compounds their risk profile. Um, it's really sad. I think the advice is to never worry alone. Like, I think always like reach out, find community, even if it's just reading the comments section of a social media post, that's, and you don't need to put yourself out there, but finding a trusted friend, finding someone that does understand not necessarily the complexities of ADHD, but just someone who you can go to. Because I think lots of people, I mean, ADHD and autism generally, but the combination of ADHD, I think, creates a bit of a perfect storm for social isolation because of this anxiety and this lack of self-worth. You want to be social, but you're also aware that being social creates future anxiety. Um, something I'm really aware of myself. I think why I suspect one of the earliest memories I have of feeling different was one of the kids saying, "Alex, you could be one of the cool kids if you weren't so weird." And I think looking back, I used to turn up to school and everyone was playing in the playground. I used to go straight to the library first thing in the morning. And I remember just staring out the window and looking down at the playground and seeing everyone playing and thinking like, well, why can't I do that? Why am I up here in the library on my own and everyone's down there playing? Um, but that seems to be like an echo of so many people with ADHD. It's like this. It turns you put yourself out there sometimes, and that's masking, and then you maybe get some feedback that some approval gets taken away or whatever it is, and so you isolate yourself. You stop maintaining that friendship, or you're too fearful to go back into work. Um, yeah, I think it is a high risk
Mm.
dual sort of diagnosis, or it's a high. You have to be really aware and hopefully put things in place to limit your social isolation. But it's a powerful force, I think, pulling us inwards because it feels safer. It feels safer and less vulnerable to lock ourselves away and watch Netflix on our own or whatever it is. But I think never worrying alone, reaching out, finding someone to talk to, whatever that looks like, is so important. I've just been through a really, I think, vulnerable period in the last 12 months with, you know, personally with my relationship that has hit a bit of a it's all fine. But I suspect I have OCD as well, and my obsession towards the podcast suddenly turned towards an obsession towards my relationship ending. And my podcast producer has really been my rock that I've lent on to get me through the last 3 months. Um, and I think it's so risky when you have this internalized ability to maybe hyper focus on something, whether that's a relationship or a piece of work or a new hobby, whatever it is. Like that can be great sometimes, but it's also quite unpredictable when that can shift.
Mm.
Um, and some external trigger can move the focus onto something quite toxic. And that's when someone who's been sober for a long time can relapse. That's when someone who's, you know, depressed can be really vulnerable. So I think, yeah, finding, having that safe person is so critical, for you to have that point of communication when perhaps, the focus, which can be brilliant in ADHD and AuDHD, can turn to something quite dangerous.
Yeah, yeah, I completely agree. Thank you, Alex, because I resonate with almost everything you said, including the fact that you used to hide in a library at break time. I think that's how I started reading, because my parents never read me any books. I just go to the library and find books myself. And also totally hear you about like self-medication with ADHD and how actually I've realized even when we get diagnosed and get medicated, that doesn't really end. We just find a different way to cope sometimes. And actually, for the record, when you start ADHD medication as someone with ADHD, your autistic traits will become even more pronounced. And you would even like want to stay home more, and then doesn't actually help the social anxiety, but it does help you focus and do more work, which seems to be the end goal for, getting diagnosed with ADHD and starting medication. But I also hear you about the RSD and, doing this work. And I've done this work for a few years now, in neurodiversity, and the field has massively changed, with so many like organizations that were there before, it's collapsed. Now it feels like we're building a new world, and we're living in this age of, social media. And like I read something today, they say, our parents, the baby boomers, they work hard, but they have hope. And Gen Zs are actually quite depressed and burnout because no matter how much they work, they don't know if it's going to equate to anything. Um, Maybe it's because like, platforms are like it's about the algorithms now, it's about the numbers, everyone's going into tech. It does feel like are we going to be able to bring our work out there, if we work really hard? It seems like now you also need strategy, you also need connection and collaboration. I think that's also what's bringing up anxiety, in so many people in the community. Um, but also, I understand where you come from, where, it can look like to the world that you're doing something that is really big, and people don't think that actually a lot of the time we are just in our bedrooms like by ourselves, or we have one other person to talk to. It's lonely, at I won't even call it a top. It's lonely when you try and do something new, then. And also your way of working is very much like you want autonomy, and you're kind of working by yourself. And maybe I can count, 5 fingers, the people I have that I can call, and I don't have a partner at the moment. So I'm actually very, very much at peace because of that. But also like this whole journey about finding out who you are, is so poignant in the community. Like the central theme in the ADHD Women Survey that I found is that people wonder who they are, after masking so long. And for women, we know also from the research that came out in Professor Gina Rippon's book on the lost girls of autism, it said ADHD women, no, so ADHD women tend to have autistic social communication patterns, and we can be like actually socially driven, actually want to connect with people, but at the same time do not know how to maintain that connection. And that comes with the loneliness. Actually, that's basically why I love doing these community events, these talks that I do with women with ADHD and AuDHD over the years. And it felt like every time I go in there, even if I just share a part of myself, like it's like we're there together. And then I never see them again, which is just very, very sad. But then it always feels like you're my only friends right now. And that's why like I want to keep doing this work. And yeah, and that's why I created the Phoenix Convention, because I feel like every time we talk about this, even us talking about it now, it can bring up, a piece of someone else's life, in their head. And how do we co-regulate people at the same time, right? Whilst we talk about the things that are very, very, very personal. I want to touch on a few of the comments. I think there were some comments around perimenopause and hormone swings, especially falling or unstable estrogen, control of dopamine and adrenaline, noradrenaline. That's why ADHD symptoms like brain fog, distractibility, low motivation, mood swings, sleep problems often get worse. Yeah. And what I found with ADHD is that, when people say when women go into certain times of the month, then the symptoms get worse. And then certain parts of the month, it's like, okay, I guess. But then what I find with ADHD is that that isn't necessarily true. Because even when we're supposed to be in the better parts of the month, sometimes if things swing a little bit too far in the dopamine, norepinephrine curve, then during the best parts of our month, we can also burn out from that, getting like hyper stimulated and want to do too much. And then you don't sleep so much, because you're doing too much. And then when we enter the luteal phase, a lot of the women in my survey have said that it's funny, they go through an existential anxiety during that time. And that's when you go like, oh, what's happening in my life? What am I doing? Who am I? And then very powerfully, they also say that as soon as that phase is over, I'm fine. I'm fine. And sometimes it can just be a switch, when estrogen comes in. And my journey has been to level out these hormones throughout the month, because the ADHD nervous system doesn't really like changes. And from my research, it's looked like it is the time of the month where there are either a sharp decrease in our sex hormones, or like an increase that we feel most compounded effect. So that time straight after ovulation, when our sex hormones like plummet, and then going towards the menstruation. And so I have always been so aware of what's happening internally. And I think that is part of the problem, because when you hyperfixate on what's going on inside, the anxiety can worsen. Um, and for me, it's like my whole journey has been to level out what's going on internally, so I can then show up, and figure out how to put scaffoldings around my life and, almost rebuild from what works better. And I guess, my question is like I figure out how to do that through looking at all these different moving parts, and for women it's the yeah, it's the neurotransmitters, the hormones, the co-occurring conditions, and then the life demands, and I look at all these different layers that perhaps are not being tackled when someone goes for a diagnosis, and also support. And support needs to be holistic, because it's not just medication, it's also hormones, it's therapy, and all this needs to be more, I think, gender inclusive. So the things that people do miss are, are you asking somebody what their life stage is and what are the demands that rule their life? And are they having support, in their environment? Like you say, a safe person is so important, and RSD can affect relationships. So are you having anchors or support in the in that space? And what are the expectations on you, like you as a man and me as a woman in society, right? Because we all have these expectations that it's put on us. We don't want it, but it's put on us, and it's not really fair, because we don't really choose to have these roles, but they are there. And how are we, either masking or camouflaging to go through our days? And actually, underneath that, there is the ADHD or the ADHD. So when people go straight to look for the ADHD and AuDHD neurotypes and ignoring all these different layers, right? Then how are you really going to get to the actual support that the person needs, you know? Um, and so that's my understanding because, Alex, like for you, like what the world sees could be your strength, you know, but then what about what you truly need? Where are you going to get that support, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, Sam. I mean, community is so important, podcasts, books, um, events. I think, I mean, RSD is huge, right? I mean, RSD is the reason I started the podcast. I think it shows up in so many. I mean, sensitivity to rejection, I don't think is an exclusive um, neurodivergent experience. I think as human beings, we don't want to be excluded. Um, it, it, a long time ago, that would have been fatal for us if we were kicked out of a tribe and we wouldn't have survived. So we have like this reaction to criticism, and that is painful because it's almost like a survival instinct. I think it's definitely heightened within the neurodivergent community because of lots of exposure to comments of difference. Um, RSD is, I think it's the Achilles heel for many people with ADHD, autism, or ADHD. It's this instant, visceral, physiological pain reaction to real or perceived criticism. It doesn't even need to be real. It can be perceived, and yes, the response is painful. Um, it can be an immediate internalized or externalized sadness, rage. When not understood, it can cause huge problems. Right? It can set off grenades in the workplace, in relationships, within friendship groups. Um, you can say things in the moment that are disproportionate to the comment that triggered you. RSD, it for me, it's the main motivator because it nearly cost me my life. When I was starting my social media brands back in 2013, they grew really quickly and I desperately needed help. I was getting overwhelmed at the workload, and I put out a post asking to meet these two men. We were all going to go into business together. And I remember meeting them in Brighton, and they offered me to sign this bit of paper. And I remember that day, my intuition was screaming at me. My gut feeling, my judge of character was like shouting at me, telling me not to trust these two people. Um, but I signed the bit of paper that day. Um, and I look back at why I signed that bit of paper, and I now know it's because I was such a big people pleaser. So scared of confrontation, didn't know how to say no, didn't know how to put any boundaries around me. Um, and it's so clear now it's because I was so fearful of this feeling. Yes, the fear of criticism is painful, but it's the things that we implement around our lives that causes so much more damage. It's being in situations that we're not comfortable with because we don't know how to say no a lot of the time. Signing that bit of paper, a couple of weeks later, I was kicked out of the company because I signed that bit of paper. I went to see a lawyer, and he said, if you want to fight this is going to be won or lost in a courtroom, and you're going to have to give evidence on the witness box. Um, I had my first panic attack in a classroom when I was 6 years old. Sat there happily daydreaming, minding my own business. And the teacher pointed at me and said, "Alex, do you know the answer to this question?" And all of the kids turned and looked at me. And in that moment, I felt my heart rate going, and I ran out of the classroom, called an ambulance, found someone in the corridor. I said, "Please help me. I'm having a heart attack." And the paramedic reassured me that I wasn't having a heart attack. I was having my first anxiety attack at 6 years old. And when the lawyer told me that I was going to have to go into a witness box and give evidence, my mind flashed forward to the all of the attention on me, like the judge, their legal team, my legal team were going to be there. And my mind flashed back to my experience in that classroom. And I remember I ran out of my solicitor's office and I went to buy a bottle of vodka. And I can only explain what the nurse told me when I woke up in hospital the following morning is that two members of the public had found me. I was still clutching the bottle of vodka. I was in an alleyway. I tried to stagger away. I tripped, hit my head on the wall, and they called an ambulance. And as the nurse was telling me this, I remember just feeling this shame and anxiety. And in that naive state, I knew the thing that I needed to cure this anxiety was more alcohol. And I knew there was a petrol station on the other side of the road. And I stood up from the hospital bed, ran out of the ward. Um, Hospital security had been called. And before I knew it, I was being restrained on the floor. And as my face was pressed against the floor, I looked out and I saw my parents, and they were looking at me with this look of fear and desperation in their eyes. You know, they didn't know what was wrong with me. Um, that took me to an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting where I first heard those four letters, ADHD. Fast forward 2 months, the trial happened in London, and the judge, I was cross-examined for 9 days. Um, but I got through it. The judge was very accommodating. He let me take regular breaks. He let me um, walk off my anxiety. I remember being sick in the toilet. Um, Fast forward another 2 months, and the telephone went, and it was my solicitor, and he said, "Alex, are you on your own?" And he said, "Yes." I said, "Yes," and he said, "You've won everything. You've won the company's back." Um, and I remember in that moment, like falling to my knees and bursting into tears because it was a 5 year legal battle, but it was a huge mental health battle that nearly cost me my life through alcohol and not knowing how to manage the anxiety. And it was all caused by that one inability to not people please um, in Brighton 5 years before.
Yeah.
And I really reflected on like, why did I sign that bit of paper? And it was so clear that it was this fear of criticism, this fear of rejection that didn't, in that really important moment, enable me to stand up for myself and say, look, actually, do you mind if I just take this bit of paper away and get back to you tomorrow? Like, if I just put a pause between that request of my time and attention and how I actioned that,
Mm.
then I would have slept on it. I probably would have got legal advice. I
Mm.
would have removed myself from this heightened state of not wanting to let them down, even though my intuition was screaming at me, like I didn't have the confidence to believe to listen to it. And I think that's so true with so many people with ADHD, autism, or ADHD is like we have amazing intuition. We can see things that other people miss. I joke saying when a celebrity or whatever, someone gets cancelled, so many people in the community, like I've been saying that for years, when I knew he was a wrong one, or I knew there was something up with it. And I think it's true, but we see it in relationships or in the workplace, but we don't have the confidence sometimes to act on it
Mm.
until it's too late sometimes. But I feel like, yeah, RSD is the heart really of all the work that I'm doing, because I feel like there's so many positives associated with being different.
Mhm.
Um, but the knock-on effect of being different is that you are exposed to comments like, stop being lazy, why can't you just stop fidgeting? Why aren't you doing it the normal way? All of these things that compound over a lifetime to create an adult that's so scared of criticism. So they don't have the confidence to lean into their strengths. And I think that's the saddest part of this whole conversation. Like I truly believe that great minds think differently. So many people with ADHD, ADHD, autism are capable of doing amazing things. It's just their energy is misplaced. It's going towards hiding from their strengths, like changing who they are in order to fit in, and that's exhausting. Um,
Yeah.
it's such a yeah, I think, recognizing your differences as being brilliant and learning how to lean into them um, is the core really of my motivation on the podcast.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Like you focus on the strengths, the things that light you up, which naturally does, charge your brain and, make you feel at peace. Um, and, I understand also from what you said about RSD, how I feel like with RSD, the most difficult thing in our life then can be relationships and how, we kind of like come across people and then not knowing what they want as well. Like one of the big thing the community has said is not understanding people's intentions. And even if you do understand it or you feel it in your body, you also do not know what is the right course of action, the decision to make at the time, because your brain is bombarded by all the stimuli, right? With RSD, then like there is that core identity piece, someone has asked on in the comments, the biggest difficulty for me at the moment is understanding who I am. What are the starting points in actually working this out? And from what you said, like you start with your strengths, and focus on them, and then you still do have your life, to kind of figure out. And it's like I don't think everyone can figure this out in one sitting. And for me now, and it's very, very much, tied to my journey, is that I've started to be really, really discerning in who I work with and who I even choose to go out with or be friends with in a way that I've never done before. And this discernment isn't to cut anyone out, it's actually to sit a bit longer and see, do our values align? I think we talked about this like when we're autistic. I think integrity and honesty is really important. And for me, I need to know if the other person also holds the same bar, because in my experience, people don't, you know? And it's not just the neurodiverse community, like just anyone, people can be manipulative, people could like have hidden agendas. And I much prefer if we bring it all, up in front and to the center. And as to who we are, that's been my hyper focus for so long. I think one of the questions you asked me is like, how do you know, to create these boundaries if you don't know what you actually need and who you are? And I think that's why actually understanding these different layers that make you, and that begins obviously with your neurotype, but that also then, is contributed by the story of your life, how your life began and how then, the little messages that you've heard over your life, how did that shape you, and actually, are you really the person, that has gone through all that and adapted, to who you become now? Or was there a more authentic part of you that you haven't brought out, to the fore? And everything that you do that's getting results, is potentially your authenticity, really truly shining, and where perhaps you're meant to be, but it's definitely a gradual process. But like whenever women come to me asking this question, I take them through my TOTI framework from my ADHD program, where it's called Tip of the Iceberg, where there are all these layers, that make up identity. And I combine both science and soul. It's never just science, though. It's never just clinical view. It's also the stories of our lives. I think that's such an important concept, and that's for the loneliness and feeling like you're alone. Like that's why I created a community events, to kind of bring people together. The Phoenix Convention that I will both teach and co-regulate at the same time. I wonder, Alex, if you want to do another breath work, like, because we have talked a lot about stuff that were quite difficult for you.
Yeah. Yeah, I was just going to add on a little bit
Yeah,
to,
do that.
if you're happy.
Yeah, of course, of course.
Just a really a bolt on to like finding out who you really are, because it's a huge question. I think um, exactly what you just said, and asking yourself those self-awareness exercises, but also like really, and this is something what I've been doing recently, is really paying attention to what you do when you're on your own, and when no one's watching, when there is no accountability. Like, what do you actually do? Like, when I'm driving in my car and I'm on my own, like, I turn the volume up and I'm singing my heart out, and that's part of me. No, there's no, and this is what not. Funny enough, I don't do that when I'm in busy roads. This is what I'm doing when I'm driving down country lanes and no one's here. Um, when I'm in my flat, I've realized that I'm lazy sometimes. I think there's so much like narrative around you can't be lazy, but I am lazy a lot of the time, and that's fine. If no one's around and I'm just sat doing nothing, I have a bath for an hour, or I just sit on the sofa and literally do nothing. Like, there is a part of me that is lazy sometimes, and that's fine. If I will deep dive into YouTube and figure out all the details about a latest obsession I'm having, or I'm figuring out like a new organizational planner that like I'm part of who I really am is trying to is really enjoying like being more like efficient with my time sometimes. But other times it's so essentially it's like what do you do? What and also what do you do that like time stops when you do it? Like what can you do and suddenly you're like, oh, I've just done that and wow, time just went so fast. Like I find that when I'm doing my podcast episodes. And that's really rare. Like when you're doing something and you're like, oh wow, I didn't realize we were talking for an hour, or I didn't realize we've been here for 2 hours or whatever. Like that's a sign that you really, really actually liked doing that, and it wasn't like a show.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're talking about things that give you joy, you know, because there's yeah, there is the RSD, but there's also the autistic joy, where you feel it viscerally, right? Everywhere. And for me, when you think you're being lazy, you're just being present to life. We're not meant to hustle 24/7, taking a bath or sitting on a sofa, which is so comfortable. It feels great to ourselves. That's something that we don't talk about enough, I suppose. We talk a lot about productivity and, strength, superpowers, blah. But yeah, what about actually being present to our own life, right? That is more important than anything. Um, yeah, I actually have one more question. Actually, it's not so much a question, it's more like an observation from, and also someone in the community, my WhatsApp group did ask me. It's about this recent podcast episode that you did with a Cambridge psychiatrist that I actually find both triggering and love at the same time. Triggering from the clinical perspective, because it was about borderline personality disorder and ADHD. And that to me has been such a problem. And I posted so many articles online after initially only talking about it in community spaces that women, and I know men do as well, because I've had ADHD men who messaged me and said that they've been diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, and then women have like misdiagnosed because it's been confused with like shutdown and meltdown, from traumatic response. And also some people do actually want the label because then it answers something. But we all know that the label doesn't actually help because then it follows you and you're then seen as you're the problem. Like who wants to be called borderline? I'm not really sure. And then even worse, EUPD, emotionally unstable. I'm sorry if this offends anyone, but personally, the reason I feel so strongly about it is because a trainee therapist did, openly say, from what you're telling me, it looks like there's some borderline traits in there when I was going through my divorce and everything. And I stopped talking to her. I just felt like that was like she couldn't just say that, from all the challenges that I was like kind of talking about in therapy. And you said to the psychiatrist in the podcast with BPD and ADHD that perhaps that intense emotional response that we get may be due to being invalidated and maybe even gaslit, from manipulation that is happening to us. And the psychiatrist said, I never thought about it that way. And that really shocked me. Did they not think to see the person as a human? And when they were looking for labels and traits, and the fact that you could bring that human's perspective, to clinical view, I think that is so important. And that then makes me think, how do you know? You know, is it because this is something that has crossed your mind, when perhaps, in relationships, like you have sense manipulation and and that has been your response, and then you think that something is wrong with you, because that's certainly my response, because when something feels unsafe or someone feels unsafe, then you really don't know what to expect, and then you start wondering, am I going mad here, or is the person trying to manipulate me? You just don't know. So, yeah, what do you think about that?
Yeah, it's a huge, huge topic. I mean, I think you can spiral with intrusive thoughts. I get them a lot, and you sort of you can spiral negatively quite quickly, to the point where almost like the compulsion is to seek reassurance just to bring you back up. But then you start doing that often enough that you start to question whether the response to your efforts to seek reassurance is almost like a gaslighting exercise, and the person on the other end is actually getting fed up with your constant need of reassurance, and that can kind of spiral it along. I think, all of these things is so complex. I've certainly considered, that's why I did that episode, ADHD and BPD, because I think it's, I've been called Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde multiple times, considerable mood swings in my past relationships. The tiniest thing can I think outwardly change my personality quite drastically. I mean, instantly. It's like literally, like is it RSD or is it BPD or is it um, reacting to something organic? It's a really tricky minefield to tread, and it's so confusing for the person not only who's living it. I think it comes with a lot of shame because you're aware of how confusing your behavior is to those around you. And you just tell yourself that it's embarrassing and you're a letdown and you're a disappointment, or you're not worthy of being with romantically or in a friendship. And so it can really be a dark place, this crossover. Um, but yeah, the crossover between ADHD and BPD is something I'm hoping to explore more. As I mentioned earlier, OCD is something that's kind of my current hyper focus, but I'm sort of I'm unboxing that only because yeah, really bizarrely, 4 months ago, something happened that uh, triggered. I use the word triggered. I don't know if that's the right word. This, like, my focus has been obsessively on the podcast for 2.5 years, and I think that's partly why it's grown so fast. Like, I wake up and it's like I think about it. I'm thinking about it throughout the day, and at the time, it's been at the detriment to my relationship and my personal life. I think it has to be when you have that degree of
Yeah.
obsession. And I wrap that with, but I think something happened that moved the goalposts, and suddenly I was obsessing over um, my relationship being not as strong as I thought it was, and my attention. The podcast really wobbled for 3 or 4 months. I've just been recycling content on social media just to kind of fill the gap whilst I'm getting through this issue. I seem to have snapped out of it now, which is brilliant. I'm trying to figure out why. And when I find the answers, I'm going to speak about it. But I think, you know, it's easy to look at that, the last sort of 4 months of my life, and think, how could you go from like just being super passionate, talking about ADHD every day, growing this podcast, to suddenly not being able to even think about the podcast, and you're only like thinking and seeking reassurance about this personal matter in your life. And it wasn't like it was consistent for 3 months.
Mhm.
Um, and I think that kind of behavior to outsiders could be labeled as BPD, or is it just a triggered OCD? I really don't know, and I'm trying to figure that out now. And I'm going to be speaking about my findings as they come on the podcast. But it's just another it's another complication to the whole story and to the whole landscape, which I think, personally, I think having spoken to so many professionals and experts, like, they're so woefully behind their understanding of all of this. I think
Yeah.
it's so easy to just slap on a label of BPD or whatever, depending on. But I think OCD, BPD, I think it can be fleeting. I think, from my experience and from speaking to others, I think it's not like you are BPD, that is you forever. I think it can be circumstantial
Yeah.
OCD, perhaps. Again, I'm not an expert. I'm just a podcast host.
Like, we talked about this, right, in the podcast, like about the ADHD, like neurotype. You can swing from like being quite hyperfixated and controlling to then like actually quite unstable or over flexible, and that can look confusing to people. And the thing is, right, Alex, like the challenge sometimes when we confront triggers, when we don't have a space to express ourselves, when we feel misunderstood, it really hits that core wound of, why don't people really truly know what I feel? And you've asked me, and I've said, what if we have created an archetype that is like a surface persona, that underneath that people don't really know who you are deep down. And and so my answer is to bring that suppression out to the surface, the surface, and like try and integrate this two states, because women have been suppressed for centuries, we are rising now. And I do feel like to an extent, men also have been playing a certain role, but with neurodivergent men, you have had to confront that role with being neurodivergent, and that brings along its own complications. How do I become my true self when this is the flavor that people prefer, you know? And I guess, yeah, for a lot of us, it's about like owning ourselves radically, and not be afraid of that, and just outwardly tell people if something doesn't align, right? That helps a lot, and you learn from your past, like to be more discerning now, right? I think that's what you're doing. Thank you for sharing your thoughts today. I really appreciate it. And I'll be answering more like of the comments after this. Um, it's 1:10 now. Did you want to do a quick breath work or just to finish? And and
Yeah, yeah, sure. If you've got
Okay,
time.
I hope if whoever is still on right now, you can join us. And I think it'll be really great that we kind of co-regulate together after being in this space, talking about things that are really personal and that might confront triggers that come out. So, okay, let's take a moment now to ground ourselves. If you sit comfortably and gently close your eyes. And so you inhale through your nose for a slow count of 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold your breath softly at the top of 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. And exhale gently through your mouth for 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. And pause at the bottom for 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. I hope you can notice how your body feels. Hope your mind is settled. You can bring your awareness fully into this moment and back to the world and go into your life and spread some joy, get some joy. So thank you so much for joining me. It's been really, really great to have you. And I look forward to the next conversation.
Thanks, Sam. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Alex. All right, I'll speak to you later. Bye.